The family is mystified by their dog's insistent barking at the baby's crib. When they check on the baby, they uncover a terrifying reason behind the dog's behavior. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of the Smith family's home in Willow Creek. Sarah Smith stood at the counter, methodically preparing breakfast, while the sounds of her husband Tom's playful interaction with their baby, Lucas, drifted in from the backyard. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and toast, creating a picture of domestic tranquility that would soon be disrupted. The family's German shepherd, Max, lay quietly on his bed near the back door, occasionally lifting his head to watch Sarah's movements. Everything seemed normal until Max's ears suddenly perked up, his body becoming rigid. Without warning, he bolted from his position and charged toward Lucas's empty Burko inside the house. His barking was different this time, not the usual alert barking at squirrels or passing cars, but something more urgent and aggressive. The abrupt change in Max's behavior caused Sarah to drop the spatula she was holding. Tom rushed inside with Lucas in his arms, his face showing concern. Max continued barking at the Burko, his tail straight and rigid, hackles raised along his spine. When Tom approached to investigate, Max's barking intensified, and he positioned himself between Tom and the Burko, as if trying to protect them from something. A thorough inspection of the Burko revealed nothing unusual. The fresh sheets were undisturbed. The mobile hung motionless above, and the stuffed animals sat in their usual positions. Yet Max remained unconvinced, maintaining his aggressive stance and refusing to leave the area. Sarah attempted to calm him by offering treats and gentle words, but the usually obedient dog ignored her completely. Meanwhile, across the street, in a Victorian-style house that had seen better days, Helen Thompson stood at her window, watching the scene unfold at her daughter's home. The curtains were drawn back just enough for her to observe the commotion, and despite the distance, she could feel something was amiss. A cold shiver ran down her spine, reminiscent of the sensations she'd experienced in her recent dreams. Helen's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her cup of tea, her mind drifting back to stories her own grandmother had told her about the area's history. Tales of restless spirits and mysterious occurrences that she had dismissed as mere folklore now seemed to carry more weight. The previous night's dream came flooding back. She had seen a dark figure standing over Lucas's Burko, its form indistinct but undeniably present. As the day progressed, Max's behavior showed no signs of improvement. He alternated between guarding the Burko and pacing anxiously around it, refusing to eat or take his usual afternoon nap. Sarah and Tom exchanged worried glances, their attempts to maintain normalcy becoming increasingly strained. The peaceful routine of their household had been disrupted, and an undercurrent of tension began to take hold. Helen continued her vigil from across the street, her unease growing with each passing hour. The stories of her youth, which she had kept buried in the recesses of her memory, began to surface. Tales of houses built on ancient burial grounds, of spirits that attached themselves to innocent children, and of warnings that came through the behavior of animals. All these narratives now seemed less like fiction and more like cautionary tales she should have heeded. The sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows of both houses. Inside the Smith home, Max remained vigilant, his behavior a constant reminder that something had changed in their once peaceful household. The family's evening routine carried on, but there was an underlying tension that couldn't be ignored. Tom and Sarah tried to rationalize Max's behavior, suggesting he might be sick or responding to some unknown stimulus. But deep down, they knew this was different from anything they'd experienced before. As night fell over Willow Creek, the first chapter of their ordeal was just beginning. The quiet suburban streets showed no outward signs of the disturbance within the Smith household, but 3 generations of the family, Helen in her Victorian home, Sarah and Tom in their modern house, and baby Lucas in his Burko, were now connected by an unseen presence that Max had been the first to detect. The dog's instinctive response would prove to be just the beginning of a series of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their home and their family's history. The following days brought little relief to the Smith family. The morning after Max's initial disturbance, Tom and Sarah scheduled an urgent appointment with Dr. Martinez, their local veterinarian. The clinical examination room, with its sterile surfaces and fluorescent lighting, provided a stark contrast to the supernatural tension building at home. Dr. Martinez conducted a thorough examination of Max, checking his vitals, reflexes, and behavior patterns. The German Shepherd remained calm during the examination, showing none of the agitation that characterized his behavior at home. After running several tests, Dr. Martinez leaned against the examination table, his expression thoughtful. "Physically, Max is in perfect health," he explained, reviewing the test results. "But animals, especially dogs, can perceive things we humans can't. Their sensory capabilities extend far beyond our own." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "In my 20 years of practice, I've seen several cases where dogs detected serious issues before their owners, from gas leaks to medical conditions. Sometimes they pick up on things we can't explain." This clinical assessment, while professional, did little to ease Sarah's growing anxiety. After returning home, she found herself drawn to her laptop, spending hours researching the history of their house. The local library's digital archives revealed that their property had belonged to a woman named Eleanor Blackwood in the 1960s. The more Sarah dug, the more unsettling the information became. Eleanor Blackwood had lived alone in the house for decades, rarely leaving the property. Neighbors from that era described her as reclusive, often seeing lights in her windows at odd hours and hearing strange chanting coming from the property. Some claimed she practiced witchcraft, while others suggested she was merely a misunderstood widow. The articles painted a picture of a woman who existed on the fringes of society, neither fully accepted nor completely ostracized. One particular newspaper clipping caught Sarah's attention, a small article from 1968, describing how local children avoided the house during Halloween, claiming they saw shadows moving behind the curtains even when Eleanor was known to be away. The article dismissed these claims as childhood imagination, but given recent events, Sarah wasn't so sure. That evening, with Tom away at a late business meeting, Sarah experienced something that confirmed her worst fears. She had just put Lucas down for the night when the temperature in the nursery dropped noticeably. The baby monitor on her bedside table emitted static, and through the interference, she heard what sounded like humming, a low, melodic sound that didn't come from Lucas. Max, who had been lying in the hallway, began growling at the nursery door. His behavior had evolved from barking to a more defensive posture, as if he were protecting the house from an invisible threat. When Sarah attempted to enter the nursery, Max blocked her path, his body rigid with tension. The dog's resistance to letting anyone near the baby's room had become more strategic, less frantic than before. The sounds continued for several minutes, subtle at first, then growing more distinct. Sarah could have sworn she heard footsteps crossing the nursery floor, though the baby monitor's video feed showed an empty room. The rocking chair in the corner moved slightly, as if someone had just risen from it, yet there was no breeze in the room to explain the movement. Sarah stood frozen in the hallway, her heart pounding. The house felt different at night, as if the darkness gave permission for another reality to emerge. The familiar shadows of furniture took on menacing shapes, and every creak of the old house's settling seemed to carry meaning. Max remained at her side, his presence both comforting and concerning. If he was reacting to something real, what exactly were they dealing with? When Tom finally returned home, Sarah recounted the evening's events. The skepticism on his face faded as Max demonstrated his continued refusal to enter the nursery. They stood together in the hallway, watching their usually friendly family pet maintain his protective stance and realized they couldn't ignore the situation any longer. The night passed slowly, with both parents taking turns checking on Lucas. The baby slept peacefully, unaware of the tension surrounding him, while Max maintained his vigil outside the door. The contrast between Lucas's innocent slumber and the unsettling atmosphere in the house created a surreal scene, one that would become increasingly familiar as the family delved deeper into the mystery of their home and its previous occupant. The following morning, Helen sat in her favorite armchair at the local cafe with her longtime friend Margaret. The small coffee shop provided a cozy atmosphere, but Helen's hands trembled as she lifted her teacup, her usual composure noticeably shaken. The dreams that had been plaguing her were becoming more vivid, more insistent. "It's always the same shadow," Helen explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "It starts in the corner of Lucas's room, just watching. But then it moves. Not like a normal shadow should. It has purpose, Margaret. It moves toward the Burko." She paused, struggling to articulate the dread that accompanied these visions. "Last night, I saw it reach out toward him." Margaret, who had known Helen for over 30 years, noticed the dark circles under her friend's eyes and the nervous way she kept glancing over her shoulder. "Have you told Sarah and Tom?" she asked gently, already knowing the answer. Helen shook her head, fear of appearing senile or overly dramatic keeping her silent. "You need to tell them," Margaret insisted, reaching across the table to grasp Helen's hand. "If there's even a chance these dreams mean something, they need to know. They're not just dreams anymore, are they?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Meanwhile, back at the Smith house, Tom and Sarah made a discovery that would change everything. While changing Lucas's sheets, Sarah felt something unusual beneath the mattress. Pulling it up, they found an old leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed with age. The name Eleanor Blackwood was written in faded ink on the first page. The diary entries started normally enough, daily observations about the weather, garden plans, and local gossip. But as they read further, the entries became darker, more disturbing. Eleanor wrote about sensing presences in the house, about conducting rituals to protect herself from what she called the darkness that watches. She described drawing symbols under the floorboards and burning specific herbs to ward off evil. One entry particularly stood out. "It's not me they want. I've always known that. They're waiting for someone else, someone pure. I must protect this house, prepare it for what's coming. The rituals must be maintained, or all will be lost." Tom closed the diary, his face pale. The rational part of his mind wanted to dismiss it as the ravings of a lonely woman, but recent events made that increasingly difficult. "We should move," he said finally, breaking the heavy silence that had fallen between them. "We can find another house, start fresh somewhere else." Sarah stood at the nursery window, watching the shadows lengthen as afternoon turned to evening. "Running won't solve anything," she argued. "If something's targeting our family, who's to say it won't follow us? We need to understand what's happening here. We need to face it." Their discussion was interrupted by Max's sudden barking, not his recent aggressive warnings, but a sound of recognition. Helen stood in their doorway, her face drawn with worry. The time had come to share what she knew. "I should have told you sooner," Helen began, her voice shaking slightly. "The dreams started the night Max first began barking at the Burko. I see things, a shadow that moves on its own, always heading toward Lucas." She described her nightmares in detail, watching as Tom and Sarah's expressions shifted from concern to recognition. The connection between Helen's dreams, Max's behavior, and Eleanor's diary was undeniable. What had started as isolated incidents now formed a pattern, suggesting something far more deliberate than random paranormal activity. The shadow in Helen's dreams wasn't just a manifestation of her fears. It was something that had been waiting, perhaps for generations, for the right moment to emerge. As Helen finished speaking, Max moved to stand beside her, as if confirming her story. The dog's behavior had evolved yet again. He was no longer just protecting the Burko, but seemed to be gathering the family together, aware that their unity would be crucial in the days to come. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, and for a moment, everyone in the room watched them intently, wondering if one might move independently of its source. The time for denial had passed. Whatever presence haunted their home had successfully gotten their attention. Now, they needed to decide how to confront it. Thunder rumbled overhead as an unseasonable storm descended upon Willow Creek. Inside the Smith house, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Rain lashed against the windows, while Max, who had been relatively calm earlier in the day, suddenly became agitated. His attention focused on a specific corner of the living room, an area that had previously seemed unremarkable. The dog's behavior was different this time. Instead of his usual aggressive barking, he maintained a low, continuous growl, his eyes fixed on the corner where the shadows seemed deeper than natural. Tom and Sarah exchanged glances, their earlier skepticism giving way to a shared sense of dread. The corner Max watched so intently appeared to absorb the occasional flashes of lightning, rather than being illuminated by them. "There's something different about that corner," Sarah whispered, unconsciously stepping closer to Tom. The air in that section of the room felt noticeably colder, and both of them could have sworn they saw movement in the shadows, like fabric rippling in a non-existent breeze. Tom retrieved a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, his hands steady despite his racing heart. As he directed the beam toward the corner, the light seemed to bend slightly, creating unusual patterns on the wall. Sarah, meanwhile, had begun taking photos with her phone, hoping to capture anything their eyes might miss. Later that evening, while reviewing the photos, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. In one image, partially hidden by a shadow, she could make out what appeared to be a face. Not just any face. It bore an uncanny resemblance to their baby Lucas, but with features that belonged to a different era. Her hands trembling, Sarah pulled up the local historical society's website on her laptop. She had been researching the house's previous owners earlier, but hadn't paid much attention to the photographs. Now, scrolling through the archived images, she found what she was looking for: a photograph of Eleanor Blackwood as a young woman holding a baby. The resemblance was undeniable. The baby in the old photograph could have been Lucas's twin. Same rounded cheeks, same distinctive birthmark near the left ear that they had always assumed Lucas had inherited from Tom's side of the family. Sarah felt the room spin as implications of this discovery washed over her. A loud crash of thunder made her jump, and Max's barking intensified. The storm outside seemed to be responding to the tension within the house, each lightning flash more intense than the last. Tom joined her at the computer, his face draining of color as he saw the photograph. "This can't be a coincidence," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Eleanor's baby." Do you think she couldn't finish the sentence? The possibility too overwhelming to voice. Their contemplation was interrupted by Helen's arrival. Soaked from the rain and visibly shaken, she burst through the door without knocking. "I had another dream," she announced, water dripping from her coat onto the hardwood floor. "But this time, I was awake. The shadow. It spoke to me." Tom and Sarah led Helen to the kitchen, wrapping her in a warm blanket while she collected herself. Max followed, dividing his attention between Helen and the corner he'd been watching. The storm continued to rage outside, creating an appropriate backdrop for Helen's revelation. "In my dream, no, my vision," Helen corrected herself. "The shadow took shape. It showed me things. Memories that aren't mine. A woman performing rituals in this house, trying to protect something. Someone." She looked up at them, her eyes full of understanding. She was trying to protect a child, her child. And now, Sarah showed Helen the photograph she'd discovered. Helen's hands shook as she held the laptop, her face reflecting recognition. "This is what I saw," she whispered. "The woman in my visions. She's been waiting. All this time, she's been waiting for." Her voice trailed off as a particularly loud thunderclap shook the house. The lights flickered ominously, and for a brief moment, all three adults could have sworn they saw a figure standing in the doorway. A woman in old-fashioned clothes, her outline blurry but her presence undeniable. Max's behavior changed instantly. Instead of barking, he sat quietly, watching the doorway with an almost respectful attention. As quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving behind a silence more profound than the storm's fury. The connection between past and present, between Eleanor's baby and Lucas, between Helen's visions and the current events, was becoming clearer. They weren't dealing with a random haunting. This was something deeply personal, a story that had been waiting generations to be told. The storm continued through the night, but its natural fury seemed insignificant compared to the supernatural tension building within the house. Whatever force had been trying to communicate with them was getting stronger, more insistent. The time for passive observation was ending. Soon, they would need to confront the truth about their home's history and their family's unexpected connection to Eleanor Blackwood. The next morning, with the storm's aftermath still visible in scattered branches and wet leaves across the yard, the family gathered at Helen's Victorian house. The setting seemed appropriate. Her home, filled with antiques and family heirlooms, created an atmosphere conducive to unraveling historical mysteries. Sarah spread the contents of Eleanor's diary across Helen's large oak dining table, while Tom arranged printouts of historical documents and photographs he'd gathered from the town archives. The morning light filtering through the lace curtains illuminated their impromptu investigation board. "Look at this entry." Sarah pointed to a page, dated June 1965. Eleanor writes about a binding ritual she performed in the house. She mentions something about tethering protective energies to specific objects. The diary described elaborate ceremonies involving candles, herbs, and intricate symbols drawn in salt. Helen ran her fingers over the diary's weathered pages, her expression troubled. "In my latest dream, I saw her performing these rituals. She was desperate, afraid of something, or someone." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "The symbols she drew, I've seen them before, in my grandmother's old books." Tom, who had been examining the historical documents, suddenly straightened. "I found something interesting in the property records," he announced. "Before Eleanor owned the house, it belonged to a religious group that was rumored to practice unconventional rituals. They sold the property to Eleanor under mysterious circumstances in 1960. Their discussion was interrupted by a sharp cry from the baby monitor. Lucas had awakened from his nap. Sarah rushed to check on him, finding the baby unusually agitated. The temperature in the guest room where he slept had dropped significantly, despite the warm spring day outside. Meanwhile, in the backyard, Max had been exploring the overgrown garden. His sudden, frantic barking drew everyone's attention. When they reached him, they found the dog pawing at a specific spot near an old oak tree. Tom retrieved a shovel from Helen's garden shed, and after some hesitation, began to dig. Several inches down, they uncovered a small metal box, its surface corroded with age. Inside, they found a collection of items, a handful of photographs, a small leather-bound book different from the diary, and what appeared to be a child's silver rattle, tarnished black with age. The photographs showed Eleanor at various stages of her life, but one image particularly caught their attention. Eleanor standing with a group of people, all wearing similar pendant necklaces. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "The Circle of Protection, 1959. Helen's hands trembled as she opened the small book. Unlike Eleanor's diary, this book contained what appeared to be ritual instructions, protective spells, and warnings about dark forces that sought to harm innocent souls. The writing was in multiple hands, suggesting it had been passed down through generations. "This explains something," Helen said quietly. "The Circle of Protection wasn't just a group, they were guardians. They believed they were protecting the area from something ancient, something malevolent." She turned a page, revealing a detailed drawing of a symbol that matched one they'd found behind the wallpaper in Lucas's nursery. As evening approached, their research was interrupted by Max's disappearance. The dog, who had been resting near the oak tree, had vanished without a trace. Tom and Sarah searched the neighborhood, calling his name while Helen stayed with Lucas. The search extended into the night, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness as they combed the area. Neighbors joined the search, but there was no sign of Max. His disappearance felt symbolic, as if he had been led away by something they couldn't see. Back at Helen's house, she cradled Lucas while watching through the window. The baby seemed unusually alert, his eyes fixed on something in the darkness outside. Helen followed his gaze but saw only shadows. Shadows that seemed to move with purpose, gathering around the old oak tree where they'd found the box. The discovery of the box and Max's disappearance marked a turning point. What had started as a series of unsettling events was revealing itself to be part of a larger pattern, a protection ritual that had been maintained for generations. The question now wasn't just about what was happening in their home, but why Eleanor and her circle had felt such an urgent need to establish these protections in the first place. As the night deepened, the family's concern for Max was overshadowed by a growing realization. They weren't just discovering the house's history, they were becoming part of its ongoing story. The protective circle that Eleanor had been part of seemed to be reaching out across time, trying to warn them about something that was still very much present. At Helen's house, tension mounted as Tom and Sarah arrived, seeking help, their faces drawn with worry over Max's disappearance. Helen met them in her study, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Without speaking, she walked to an old chest in the corner, its brass fittings dulled with age. Using a key she wore around her neck, she unlocked it. "I should have shown you this sooner," Helen said, carefully lifting out a leather-bound volume that seemed to hum with its own energy. The book was massive, its covers adorned with strange symbols that seemed to shift in the lamplight. "This has been in our family for generations. I never understood its significance until now." The book's pages were made of vellum, covered in handwritten text and intricate diagrams. Some entries dated back centuries, written in various languages and hands. As Helen carefully turned the pages, they found sections about protective rituals, supernatural entities, and most importantly, a detailed account of the force that had been haunting their house. "Look at this." Sarah pointed to a passage written in faded ink. It describes a guardian spirit bound to protect bloodlines from a malevolent entity. The guardian can only reveal itself when the bloodline is threatened. The text was accompanied by illustrations of symbols identical to those they'd found in Eleanor's diary. While they studied the book, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The temperature dropped suddenly, and shadows deepened in the corners. A dark shape moved swiftly across the wall, causing them all to freeze. Max's distant barking could be heard, though the dog was nowhere to be seen. Tom reached for the light switch as the bulbs began to flicker, but Helen stopped him. "No," she said firmly. "We need to see what it wants to show us." The shadows continued to move, becoming more defined, more purposeful. They could make out a feminine shape forming in the darkness. Sarah clutched the book tightly, her eyes wide as she watched the manifestation. The pages began to turn on their own, stopping at an illustration of a ritual circle. The temperature dropped further, their breath visible in the cold air. Max's barking grew louder, more urgent, seeming to come from all directions at once. When he finally appeared in the doorway, his fur was standing on end, and his eyes reflected an unnatural light. His behavior had changed. He no longer seemed frightened, but rather determined, as if he had been given a purpose. "The book mentions animal guardians," Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They serve as bridges between our world and the spirit realm." Max padded into the room, positioning himself between them and the shadow figure, but his posture was no longer aggressive. Instead, he sat calmly, as if waiting. The shadow began to take more definite shape, revealing features that matched the photographs they'd found of Eleanor. The spirit's presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of urgency. Objects on Helen's desk began to vibrate, and papers scattered as an unfelt wind swept through the room. Sarah opened the book to the page about protective rituals, her hands shaking. It says here that the guardian spirit needs a vessel, someone willing to channel its power to complete the protection circle. She looked up at Helen, understanding dawning in her eyes. This is why Eleanor chose our house. She was waiting for someone. The shadow moved closer, its form becoming more distinct. Through Max's unusual behavior and the book's revelations, they began to understand that this wasn't a malevolent haunting, but rather a desperate attempt to communicate. Eleanor's spirit hadn't been trying to frighten them. She had been preparing them. As they grappled with this realization, a particularly strong manifestation caused books to fall from the shelves and furniture to shift. The shadow figure became clearer than ever, its features unmistakably those of Eleanor Blackwood. She seemed to be trying to speak, her form rippling with effort. Max suddenly stood, walking to the center of the room. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light as he appeared to communicate with Eleanor's spirit. The dog they had known as a family pet was revealing himself to be something more, a sentinel chosen to help bridge the gap between their world and the next. The evening had brought them face to face with forces they barely understood, armed only with an ancient book of knowledge and the growing realization that they were part of something much larger than themselves. As Eleanor's spirit maintained its presence in the room, they knew they would need every bit of guidance the book could provide to face what was coming. The mysterious grimoire, Max's transformation, and Eleanor's manifestation had turned Helen's study into a convergence point between past and present. Whatever was threatening their family, it was clear that Eleanor had spent decades preparing for this moment, leaving them the tools they would need, if only they could understand how to use them in time. As moonlight filtered through the clouds, the Smith family gathered in their backyard. Following the ancient book's instructions, they had drawn a large circle using sea salt, placing white candles at cardinal points. The night air was unusually still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Tom finished placing the final candle while Sarah drew protective symbols in the earth with a stick of white chalk, precisely copying the diagrams from the book. Helen stood at the circle's center, holding Lucas close to her chest. The baby was unnaturally quiet, his eyes fixed on something the others couldn't see. The book says we need to begin exactly at midnight, Sarah said, checking her watch. Each person must stand at their designated point. The ritual requires a blood connection. That's why Helen needs to hold Lucas. She looked at her mother-in-law, concern evident in her expression. Helen nodded resolutely. I've been preparing for this without knowing it. Those dreams weren't just warnings, they were instructions. She gently rocked Lucas, who remained eerily calm despite the tension surrounding him. As the church bell in town began to strike midnight, they took their positions. The candle flames suddenly grew taller, burning with an intense blue light. Max, who had returned to them during their preparations, sat at the circle's edge, his posture alert but calm. Sarah began reading from the book, her voice steady despite her fear. We call upon the guardians of old, those who watch and protect. We stand in the circle of trust, bound by blood and love. The words seemed to carry their own power, resonating in the still night air. The shadows around them began to move and coalesce, forming shapes that weren't quite human. Whispers filled the air, speaking in languages long forgotten. Tom gripped his candle tighter, fighting the urge to run as the darkness seemed to press in around their protective circle. Helen felt it first, a presence entering the circle, different from the threatening shadows outside. The spirit of Eleanor Blackwood materialized before them, more solid than they had ever seen her. Her expression was one of determination and urgency. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows outside the circle became more aggressive, pushing against the invisible barrier created by their ritual. Max began to growl, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light as he paced the circle's perimeter. The protection must be renewed. Eleanor's voice echoed in their minds. The Dark One grows stronger. It has waited centuries for a child born with the sight. Her form flickered as she gestured toward Lucas, who reached out toward her with tiny hands. Sarah continued reading, her voice growing stronger. We bind the darkness. We seal the gates. Through blood and spirit, we create the ward. The candle flames surged higher, and the salt line began to glow with a pale blue light. The shadows outside the circle took on more menacing forms, clawing at the barrier. The whispers turned to angry howls, and the temperature dropped dramatically. Frost began forming on the grass around them. Despite the summer night, Helen held Lucas tighter as she felt the power building within the circle. Eleanor's spirit moved closer, her form becoming more distinct. The sacrifice must be willing. Eleanor's voice resonated. The Guardian's power can only be passed freely. The dark entities outside the circle grew more frantic, their attacks more focused. The protective barrier wavered, the blue light flickering. Tom and Sarah joined hands, strengthening the circle's power through their connection. Max's growls turned to howls that seemed to echo across multiple dimensions. Helen stepped forward, still holding Lucas. I understand now, she said, her voice clear and strong. You've been waiting for someone who could bridge the gap between worlds. Someone connected to both the child and the bloodline. She looked at Eleanor's spirit, recognition dawning in her eyes. The ritual reached its crescendo as the shadows launched their most violent assault yet. The candle flames twisted like torches, and the salt line pulsed with energy. The air itself seemed to vibrate with power as Helen made her decision, accepting the role that Eleanor's spirit had been preparing her for all along. In that moment of crisis, with darkness pressing in from all sides, the true purpose of Eleanor's decades-long vigil became clear. She hadn't been haunting their house. She had been guarding it, waiting for the right moment and the right people to continue her protective mission. The night air crackled with energy as they faced the culmination of events set in motion long before any of them were born. Whatever happened next would determine not just their fate, but the fate of generations to come. In the charged atmosphere of the ritual circle, Helen stood facing Eleanor's spirit, the weight of generations of guardianship hanging between them. Lucas remained eerily calm in her arms, his eyes reflecting the otherworldly blue light that surrounded them. The Dark One seeks the child, Eleanor's spirit spoke, her voice echoing with centuries of knowledge. It feeds on innocence and power. Lucas has both. He was born with the sight, just as you were, Helen. The revelation settled over the group like a heavy cloak. Tom and Sarah watched in horror as the shadow creatures outside the circle grew more frenzied, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes. The protective barrier flickered dangerously, the salt line pulsing with each impact. Max continued his vigilant patrol, his fur glowing with an ethereal light. A sacrifice is required, Eleanor continued, her form becoming more solid, not of blood or life, but of connection. The Guardian must give up their earthly bonds to maintain the protection. She gestured toward Helen. You've always known, haven't you? The dreams, the visions, they were preparing you. Helen nodded slowly, understanding flooding her features. The nightmares weren't warnings, she said softly. They were glimpses of my purpose. She looked at Sarah and Tom, tears welling in her eyes. I won't die, but I won't be able to remain in this world as I am. The guardianship requires a complete transformation. Sarah stepped forward, her voice breaking. Mum, no, there has to be another way. The candles flickered violently as her concentration wavered, the protective circle weakening further. The shadows seized the opportunity, pressing harder against the barrier. The choice must be willing, Eleanor's spirit insisted. The power cannot be forced or coerced. It must be given freely, with full understanding of the cost. She turned to Helen, her expression softening. You will become like me, a guardian spirit, bound to protect the bloodline through the generations. Tom grabbed Sarah's hand, steadying her as she struggled with the revelation. The ancient book had mentioned sacrifices, but they hadn't understood the true nature of what was required. Helen would continue to exist, but not as the mother and grandmother they knew. Helen gently handed Lucas to Sarah, her movements deliberate and calm. "I've lived a full life," she said, smiling through her tears. "I've seen my daughter grow into a strong woman, watched her build her own family. Now I can ensure that family's safety for generations to come." The dark entities outside the circle sensed the impending transformation, their attacks becoming more desperate. The air crackled with malevolent energy as they threw themselves against the barrier, causing the candles to sputter and the salt line to dim. "If we don't act now, the protection will fail," Eleanor warned, her form flickering as she struggled to maintain her presence. "The Dark One will claim the child, and all our efforts will have been in vain." Helen stepped into the center of the circle, her decision made. "I love you all," she said, looking at each family member in turn. "This isn't an ending, it's a transformation. I'll always be here, watching over you, just as Eleanor has watched over us." Max moved to Helen's side, his role as bridge between worlds becoming clear. The dog's presence would help facilitate her transition, allowing her to maintain a connection to the physical world even as she transcended it. The time had come. Helen raised her arms, accepting her new role as guardian. The air around her began to shimmer, and her form started to become translucent. Eleanor's spirit moved closer, ready to guide her through the transformation. Sarah buried her face in Tom's shoulder, unable to watch as her mother began to fade from the physical world. Lucas reached out toward his grandmother, seeming to understand more than his infant mind should be capable of. The sacrifice had been chosen, the price would be paid, but the true test of their family's strength was only beginning. As Helen prepared to cross the threshold between worlds, the dark entities gathered their forces for one final assault against the weakening barrier. The ritual circle crackled with energy as Helen's transformation began. Her physical form started to fade, becoming translucent like Eleanor's, while the dark forces outside the circle launched their most violent assault yet. The air itself seemed to tear as reality buckled under the supernatural pressure. Sarah clutched Lucas tightly, tears streaming down her face as she watched her mother's transformation. Tom maintained his position, gripping his candle with white knuckles, knowing that breaking the circle now would doom them all. The ancient book lay open at Sarah's feet, its pages turning by themselves in the supernatural wind. "Hold the circle," Eleanor's voice commanded as the darkness pressed in. The shadow entities had merged into one massive, writhing form, the Dark One finally revealing itself. Its presence was ancient and malevolent, radiating a cold that went beyond physical sensation. The dark entity spoke, its voice like grinding stone. "The child belongs to the void." All those with the sight returned to darkness. It pressed against the barrier, causing the protective blue light to flicker dangerously. Max's growls turned into a high-pitched howl that seemed to resonate across multiple dimensions. Helen's transformation reached a critical point. Her body now floated several inches above the ground, surrounded by swirling energy. "I accept this duty," she declared, her voice echoing with new power. "I give myself freely to the protection of my blood." The Dark One recoiled momentarily, then attacked with renewed fury. Shadow tentacles lashed against the barrier while a bone-chilling screech filled the air. The candle's flames twisted like torches in a hurricane, but somehow remained lit. Sarah began reading desperately from the book, her voice stronger than she felt. "By blood and spirit, by love and sacrifice, we seal this covenant." Each word seemed to strengthen the barrier, but the Dark One's assault was relentless. Suddenly, Lucas began to laugh, a pure, innocent sound that cut through the chaos. The baby's eyes glowed with the same blue light as the protective circle, and for a moment, everything stopped. The Dark One froze, Helen's transformation paused, and even the wind fell silent. In that suspended moment, Eleanor's spirit moved to join with Helen's transforming form. Their energies merged, creating a brilliant flash that temporarily blinded everyone in the circle. When their vision cleared, they saw something extraordinary. Where Helen had stood, a figure of pure light now hovered, merged with Eleanor's essence. The combined guardian spirits radiated power that pushed back against the darkness. Max positioned himself beneath them, his form also beginning to glow as he channeled their energy. The Dark One reared back, its massive form twisting in what appeared to be pain. "You cannot deny the void forever," it howled. "The sight belongs to darkness." "No," the merged voices of Helen and Eleanor responded, their combined power growing stronger. "The sight is a gift of light, and we are its guardians." They raised their hands in unison, channeling centuries of protective magic. Tom and Sarah felt the power building around them, the air becoming thick with energy. Lucas continued to laugh, reaching toward the glowing figures of his grandmother and Eleanor, seeming to add his own innocent strength to their power. The confrontation reached its peak as both forces, light and dark, protection and destruction, clashed in a spectacular display of supernatural energy. The merged guardian spirits poured their power into the circle, while the Dark One launched its final, desperate attack. A deafening crack split the air as the two forces met. The Dark One's form began to fragment, its shadows dispersing like smoke in a strong wind. Its final scream echoed across dimensions as it was forced back, driven away by the combined power of the Guardians and the pure strength of Lucas's innocence. Yet victory came at a price. As the Dark One retreated, the transformation became permanent. Helen's human form was gone completely, merged with Eleanor's spiritual essence into something new, a powerful guardian force that would watch over their family for generations to come. The night air grew still, the supernatural wind dying away. The candles burned steadily now, their flames returned to normal. Max sat calmly, his fur no longer glowing, but his eyes still reflecting an otherworldly awareness. The battle was over, but its consequences would echo through their lives forever. Sarah, Tom, and Lucas remained within the circle, surrounded by the lingering energy of the confrontation. Their family had changed irrevocably, but they had also gained protectors more powerful than they could have imagined. As the last traces of chaos faded, they waited for a sign of what would come next. Dawn broke over Willow Creek, casting a gentle light on the aftermath of the night's supernatural battle. The ritual circle, still visible in the dewy grass, glowed faintly with residual energy. Tom and Sarah sat exhausted on their back porch, watching Lucas play contentedly in his portable crib, seemingly unaffected by the night's events. Suddenly, Lucas began to giggle, reaching towards something invisible to his parents. The air shimmered, and the merged spirits of Helen and Eleanor materialized partially, their forms now permanently intertwined in a gentle luminescence. Max lay nearby, his role as spiritual conduit having permanently altered him. His eyes now carried a perpetual gleam of otherworldly awareness. The Dark One is banished. The combined voices of Helen and Eleanor spoke softly, but not destroyed. It can never be fully destroyed, only contained, watched, and guarded against. Their form moved closer to Lucas, who reached out with tiny hands that passed through their ethereal presence. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. "Mum, Helen, will we ever see you as you were before?" The guardian spirit's form rippled with emotion. "We exist now between worlds," they explained. "We can manifest when needed, but our primary purpose is protection. Through Max, we maintain our connection to this realm. Through Lucas, we maintain our connection to the bloodline." Tom wrapped an arm around Sarah, processing the profound changes to their family. "The ancient book mentioned that the Dark One feeds on fear and isolation," he said. "Is that why it targeted Lucas?" The guardian spirits nodded, their merged form shifting like moonlight on water. "The sight runs strong in your bloodline," they explained. "Lucas has a pure connection to both worlds, making him both gifted and vulnerable. But where the Dark One sought to isolate and consume his power, our sacrifice created a circle of protection through love and choice. Max rose and padded over to Lucas's crib, assuming his new role as physical guardian. The dog's transformation had granted him extended life and awareness, making him a bridge between the physical and spiritual realms. Your lives will never be the same, the spirits continued, but you're not alone. We'll always be here, watching, protecting. The house is now a sanctuary, sealed by our sacrifice and strengthened by our combined power. As if to demonstrate, the air around the property shimmered briefly, revealing a complex web of protective energy that encompassed their home. The symbols Sarah had drawn during the ritual were now permanently etched into the spiritual fabric of the place. Invisible to normal sight, but very real in their power, Lucas laughed again, his innocent joy causing the protective web to pulse with light. The guardian spirits moved closer to him, their form becoming briefly more distinct. "He sees us clearly now," they said, "and as he grows, he'll understand his role in maintaining the balance. The sight isn't a curse to be feared, but a gift to be guided." Sarah stood, walking to the crib and placing a hand on her son's head. "Will he be safe now?" "Safer than before," the spirits assured her. "The Dark One's power is diminished, and our presence is stronger than ever." Eleanor waited decades for this moment, for the bloodline to produce a child strong enough to anchor the protection, and for a guardian willing to make the sacrifice to secure it. The morning sun rose higher, its rays seeming to pass through the guardian spirit's form, creating rainbow-like refractions. "We must go now," they said, their form beginning to fade. "But we're never far. Watch Lucas's reactions. He'll always know when we're near, and Max will serve as our messenger when needed." As the spirits faded from view, Lucas waved goodbye, then returned to playing with his toys as if nothing unusual had happened. Max settled beside the crib, his new role as spiritual guardian sitting naturally upon him. Tom and Sarah remained on the porch, watching their son play in the morning light. Their family had been transformed, but not broken. Where there had been fear, there was now understanding. Where there had been uncertainty, there was now purpose. The price had been high. The loss of Helen's physical presence was a wound that would take time to heal, but the protection it brought would last for generations. The house stood peaceful in the morning light, its walls now harboring not just a family, but a legacy of protection, sacrifice, and love that would endure through the ages. The Dark One might never be fully destroyed, but neither would it ever again pose such a threat to their bloodline. Through Helen's willing sacrifice and Eleanor's patient vigilance, they had forged a new kind of family, one that straddled the boundaries between worlds, bound together by love, sacrifice, and the eternal promise of protection.